Okay, so I'm at the home screen for Fresco right now, and the reason I wanted to start on the home screen is because for anybody who's used Photoshop or other Adobe products, this screen will look familiar to you. This is similar to what you would have with Photoshop, where you first, when you open up the app, you're going to see recent documents that you've worked on. You're also going to have access over here on the left to your files, and your files will be all of those PSDs that you've saved, all those Photoshop documents. And I want to state up front so that everybody's clear on this. Every Fresco document you create is a Photoshop file. It is a native PSD. So there's no issue whatsoever with traveling back and forth from Photoshop to Fresco. In fact, there is really no traveling that is required because the file itself, because it's saved to Creative Cloud, is already available to you the moment you open Photoshop or the moment you open Fresco. It's the same file, and everything about those files is compatible. And if something isn't compatible, you will know because that layer, when you tap on it, will tell you this is a layer you don't want to touch right now. So for example, if I were working with watercolor in Fresco, and because that's a very special kind of paint that is not recognizable yet in Photoshop, if I open that document in Photoshop, that layer will still exist. But for me to try and manipulate it, I will get a warning in Photoshop saying, if you want to mess around with this and make it into a regular raster layer, we can do that. But if you want to let it be a watercolor layer, just leave it alone. So you're always protected, you're always safe, and you have your version history for all of your files, which if you're not taking advantage of, I think everyone should know about this. It's kind of like time traveling. You always have a version of the last time you worked on a file. It's always going to be available in your version history. And you can always purposely save out a version. So it's like taking a snapshot in Photoshop, if you've ever done that in your history states. You can do that in Fresco as well, so that your version history can always be accessible to you in case you make a change that you later don't like and want to go back and go back to a previous version or revert to that version. Okay, so another thing I want to point out here on the home screen is we have underneath where it says home on the left, top left corner, you have learn. One of the things that is really convenient about Fresco is the learn materials. So if you're not familiar with the app, and I know many of you probably aren't, anything you want to learn, you can simply tap on any demo and it's going to pull up a walkthrough for you. So for example, I just tapped on brushes. And here I get to then tour what the categories of brushes are. Everything gets pointed out to me very clearly. There are these little animations that will help you to understand what's going on. And each of these walkthroughs makes it very simple for you to understand how to use the app. So anything you're interested in, if you have a question, you can always go to that learn content. That learn content, by the way, is also available up here in this little question mark where we have tutorials. There's a tour of the whole app and gestures you can use and so on. Okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. So coming back to the learn tutorials, there are also video tutorials. Okay, and we are adding to these every quarter. And eventually, there will be community-provided video tutorials. So people in the community who create videos that we think are really helpful and are well-produced, these videos are going to make it into this library. So you start to be able to search really, really specific kinds of content. So there's never an issue with having to understand how to use things. You're going to find it all in this learn content. So wanted to point that out as well. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to head over to this document right here. I was doing some sketching this morning using the default pencil in Fresco. And the reason I wanted to call attention to that brush is when you first launch the app, the Fresco pencil is by default the pencil or the brush that's going to be selected for you. So if you're going to launch the app and you know nothing whatsoever about Fresco, you can immediately just start drawing with the pencil. You don't have to know anything about layers. You don't have to know anything about tools, etc. Looking quickly at the layout here, you'll see that we have your toolbar on the left. The toolbar looks very similar to what you're familiar with Illustrator and Photoshop. So you have brushes, eraser, smudge tool, selections, and a paint bucket, and so on. We'll get to those. And then over on the right, you have your layer stack. And what I'm going to do is come up to the top right corner where the settings are, and I'm going to turn on my touches. This is going to make it difficult for me to draw because I'm going to have a big blue circle every time I touch the screen. But this is going to help you understand where I am because there is no hover state when you're working on an iPad. So I want to make sure you know where I'm going. So now you can see where I am every time I touch the screen, where that blue dot is. All right, so speaking of settings, the first thing I want to point out, I'm going to open that up for you, is that you can Flip your canvas, right, both ways, and rotate 90 degrees and so on right from over here. So if you're ever in need of doing that kind of thing quickly, you can do it right there. You also, of course, can pinch and zoom, as you would expect, with this being a touch device. Your canvas will always lock to a perfect 0 degrees, so you don't have to worry about getting it slightly off center on your rotation. If you zoom in a lot, okay, you can get up to over 12,000% on your zoom. All right, down to the pixel layer there. If you want to snap back to your 100% view, all you do is take your fingers and pinch them together quickly, like so, and you'll snap back to 100%. That pretty much covers the navigation of the canvas when you're drawing, okay? I'm going to open up the settings again, and I want to get to a couple of things that are good to know for specifics. Those of you who are using an iPad, you have actions for your double tap on the brand new Apple Pencils. For the generation previous to this Apple Pencil, there is no double tap. But for those who have it and wish to assign some kind of an action to it, you do have options here. You can see I can do the color picker. I can switch to the last brush I used. That's pretty convenient. Switch to the eraser and zoom to fit, or do nothing at all. All right. Directly beneath that right here, I want you to see adjust stylus pressure. This is a big one. Everybody draws differently. Some people have a heavy hand, some people have a lighter touch. So I like to set this to a very light setting for myself. And the reason for that is, to begin with, Fresco right out of the box is set pretty tight. And this is to mimic what people are used to with a Wacom stylus if they're using a Cintiq or another Wacom device and they're using Photoshop. If you're used to that desktop environment, most people tune their stylus to be pretty tight so they get the maximum amount of resistance when they're trying to do fine line work. We wanted to mimic that feeling for professional artists on Fresco on this new device, on the iPad. So if it feels too heavy for you, a couple things you can do. You can use these defaults right here. Okay, so you can go really, really heavy. And that's going to require quite a bit of pressure for you to draw and make a mark. And you can test it right here and see what it feels like, right? And then you can go something in the middle, okay, and all the way to this light setting, which is what I use now, mainly because I get fatigue with my wrist and my hand from drawing a lot. But you have these settings. You can also get really fancy and start making your own pressure curves if you so desire, okay? So you can do a custom pressure curve as well. All right. Gestures can be done with your fingers, but you can also with your fingers draw. You can also use your finger to erase with a brush. So whatever brush you have selected, if you want to use your finger to erase with that brush, you can do so, or you can set it to the eraser. Now, also for your eyedropper, everybody has a different preference for how long they like to tap on the screen to select a color. You can adjust that. And finally, the other thing I wanted to point out was this snap line. Snap line is a way to draw a line that is perfectly straight by drawing and then holding for a minute and drawing and waiting to draw a snap line. So watch, if I draw and pause for a moment, then I get a nice straight line, which I can move wherever I like. This is a setting that usually is on by default when you launch Fresco, but if it's not, you come up to your settings and you're going to find that you can apply that under input where it says snap line right here, okay? I'm not going to cover some of this other stuff like your account information and so on. In the general settings, though, I do want to point out for those of you who are left-handed, you might want to move the toolbar over to the right. You can do that, okay? You can swap those out. And you also have a dark mode in Fresco. So you can use your dark mode if you like, okay? For those of you who do time-lapse stuff and post it to YouTube and other places, you can do a 4K time-lapse right here. So you can set up to high resolution for your dimensions, and you can also set your quality of the video to high. So if you want to do a really nice, high-quality, high-res time-lapse of your drawing, that's what's going to happen. Everything you draw in Fresco automatically is going to be recorded anyway, so you can have an automatic time-lapse. You don't have to do anything to turn that on or off. And I think most people look at that now for a drawing app, so that's what you get. All right, so that covers a lot of the basics. I want to now look over here on the left at the toolbar. So starting with brushes, and brushes, of course, are to me the most important thing. We have pixel brushes, and like I said, when you first launch the app, you have this sketching category, which is going to give you the default pencil. When I'm drawing with the pencil in Fresco, just like a real pencil, I'm able to draw very fine lines, and the amount of pressure I use is going to determine how dark they are, as well as the flow that I use for the brush. So if you look down here in this area, I have a couple of brush settings, okay? Here is my flow. If I want to work with something like a 6H pencil, I just knock that all the way down to a very low setting. And now when I draw, I've got a very faint line, okay? So you get the full range of pencils just by adjusting the flow, anywhere from the lowest to the highest setting, 6H all the way up to 6B. So just adjust that flow accordingly to whatever you like, okay? The other thing too about the pencil is, of course, that I can use the tilt of the Apple Pencil or a Wacom stylus or whatever stylus you're using. If you're on a Windows device, I can use the tilt to make a broader stroke and do shading and so on. This is a nice natural feel we have for this pencil. This is also the only pencil in any drawing app that actually has a dynamically generated texture to it. So the texture that you get with the pencil, the graininess of that, is actually changing every time you are making a stroke. And this is something that the scientists worked on for a long time. I like it a lot, and I find that it's a pretty lovely thing to work with. So the density of it changes every time I add more pigment. Just a little bit of nerdy stuff for you there. All right, so that is the default pencil, okay? Pretty self-explanatory. Of course, if you like doing colored pencil work, just go ahead and tap on your color picker and change the color, okay? All right, let's go back up here. There's also a pen that comes in the default category. This pen is the pen that some of you might be familiar with from Sketch, which was another free drawing app that Adobe made for about 4.5, 5 years. People will recognize the qualities that this pen has, especially where if I'm drawing slowly and then make a quick line, the line is going to get slightly thinner as I speed up the drawing. So the velocity, okay, is impacting the width of the stroke. So those of you who are really used to writing with or drawing with felt tip pens or pens that have an ink flow that is going to be controlled, by moving your hand slowly. And if you speed up and you're not depositing as much ink on the paper during the length of that gesture, you're going to notice that you're going to have a thinner line. Well, you're going to get the same thing with this nice default pen. So it just has a good natural feel to it, and it's great for drawing. Okay, let's jump back here. I'm in the sketching category. I'm going to jump back. And here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 categories of brushes in Fresco when you first launch the app. Under these included categories, you'll see here it says library brushes. So what are libraries? If you're using Photoshop and you haven't been using libraries, I think you should at least look into them. They're pretty amazing. Libraries are places where you can save your favorite brushes, color themes, assets like photos and drawings and whatnot, vector shapes. All of these can be saved into a library. So what you're seeing here are libraries that I've created in Photoshop of groups of brushes, and they automatically show up in Fresco with your Creative Cloud account. So if I create a library of brushes for a specific project, for example, maybe it's 5 brushes that I'm using in and out for this certain client. If I create a library for that and I then have to jump on a plane and go somewhere with my iPad, I can open Fresco. My library of brushes that I was working with is right there. The file is already there. And I can continue working with those brushes. So libraries are a cool way to stay organized. All right, but let's take a look at these categories. So under basic, you have what you would expect from typical Photoshop general brushes. You have your hard rounds all the way through your soft round variable. These behave as you would expect and can be modified however you need. You have your charcoal brushes. So charcoals have 2 pencils, and the pencils, again, are going to have a nice quality to them that also allows you to do some shading by tilting the pencil and getting that nice width effect, okay, as well as very fine line art. They also have the vine charcoal for those of you who like to do gestural figure drawing and warm-ups, as well as do your sketches for your concept art and things like that. Really nice quality to these for drawing. And those of you who like to use vine charcoal, I teach with vine charcoal when I teach portraitures. This is the closest I could get to creating something like that in a digital world, and I'm very happy with how they work. So a bunch of those for you to explore, okay, each with a different sort of quality. And then you have your comics. Now, the comics is one of those categories where we do not include all these brushes for the free version. The reason for this is because we assume and hope that this is not a category of brushes that most people would need, but if you do have a very specific need for creating kind of comic effects and everything, then you'd be willing to maybe get this along with your Photoshop subscription or something like that. Fresco is included. But these are worth looking at. You have some crosshatch brushes, you have some halftones, and I'll point out that the halftones respond to pen pressure. So light pressure means smaller dots and then a more dense pattern as you go with heavier pressure. So this can take the work out of having to use multiple brushes for doing halftone design. And there are several categories of those, as well as, I like this one. This halftone brush gives you a nice effect. So for those of you who are looking to add a little texture in your work, this is a good one. And that gets quite dense as well. We also have some inking tools. You have a newsprint inker, a sharp inker, and vintage inks. Vintage inks is going to give you a nice broken quality to the line. If I zoom in, you'll see that it's just ever so irregular, but very responsive. So that's a nice one as well. Jumping back, we also have dry media. This is what you'd expect. You're going to get Conte crayon in there. You're going to get some graphite. Okay, graphite, of course, is going to go well with if I'm doing a pencil drawing like this and I just want to tone it really fast. I can just throw this all over the whole drawing like so. That's going to work nicely. You also have a graphite stick. Again, really nice for figure drawing. Anybody who does figure drawing, you're going to enjoy the graphite stick. That'll look familiar to anybody that has worked with my Photoshop brushes and knows about the graphite tools in the Mega Pack. Okay. Also useful for those people who are calligraphers. If you want to adjust these brushes in any way, like set the angle so that it doesn't work with the rotation of the pencil, you can set fixed angles and things like that. At the bottom left, we have all your brush settings. If you're familiar with brush settings in Photoshop, then you'll understand how all these work here. But under shape dynamics, I do not have to control the angle with pen tilt. I could just turn it off altogether, say none. And that's going to set the angle of that brush, and I can come over here and adjust it to whatever I like. So if I am doing some kind of calligraphy and I want to set it to an angle like this, then it's going to stay fixed, and I can go ahead and do something like that. All right, so moving back, you have pastels of various kinds as well as rough pencils. So for those of you who are not into that smooth graphite HB pencil or otherwise in the default pencil category, you do have a rough pencil and a scratchy pencil. And just to demonstrate what those feel like, you can see that rough pencil has a really nice gritty quality to it, right? And there's a little self-portrait for you. Remember, you can adjust the flow of these brushes. So by bringing the flow down, you'll see that I'm able to actually break apart that line, which gives me some interesting options for doing some textural toning work and things like that. And this is what Patrice was mentioning up front. Even though these are not the live brush categories, even the pixel brushes that we include that are not in that category, the objective is to emulate natural media as best we can so that you can all enjoy all these natural media effects. Speaking of effects, we have an effects category. And in the effects category, you have a lot of automation happening. So things like, for example, foliage. If you're interested in just quickly throwing down some leafy greens, this is a great option, okay? And there are several variations here. We have another foliage brush right here. And for those of you who do concept art and you got to just quickly suggest a background or something like this, this will save you a lot of time. There's also stuff like ink spreading. So this is the kind of effect if you've ever taken a damp piece of paper and dropped some ink on it or things like that, then you're going to be able to do effects like this, which is quite nice as well for those people who want to build out some skyscapes. You want to do some cloud work or things like that. Imagine doing this with white on a blue background. It's going to give you some really beautiful results. Just to demonstrate, I'll go ahead and grab some blue, and we'll throw that in with our paint bucket tool. All right. And on top of that, I'll just go ahead and throw in some of these cloudscape shapes like this. So that's a simple way to go about that. Okay. Alrighty, so we'll delete this. All of your layer actions are included in your layers. If you tap on a layer, you'll see we have options to add a layer, show a layer, delete a layer, select multiple layers, and duplicate, and so on. These will be familiar to anybody who's already using Photoshop. So nothing new to talk about there, but I just want to point out where it's located. Okay. All right, so moving on. We also have some leafy lines, some noise control, some smoke billowing, some wispy smoke, which is great for people who have like a want to do a cool. Yes, you got a
I have a
question?
question, but I'm not sure I get it because someone is asking, can we have those pencils? But those pencils are in the implication. I think I'm not sure about what pencils he was talking about, but pretty sure it was about the clouds, and perhaps the question is more about what's included in the free version.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay, I'll show you. Everything, all these categories, these 12 categories are included except for some of the effects brushes and some of the comics. Everything else is included in the free version. So you get the basic, the charcoal, the dry media, the ink, the lettering, the marker, the mixer brushes, the painting, the rakes, and the sketching.
in your experience, are there any difference between the iPad and PC version, or are they totally synced? And
Great question. Yeah, so currently the PC version is not supporting as many features with type. So anybody that has to do type in their work, I think they're going to miss out on a few things. We just added animation and perspective drawing. I'm pretty sure those are in the Windows version. But the product manager, I have to double check with him to see what's coming. The way we've worked in the past is that anything that we add to the iPad version, we never wait longer than hopefully 6 months to have it all included in the Windows version as well, depending on how robust the feature is. Some things get released at the same time, some take a little while longer. That's why the type, for example, because it's complicated to work with Windows with type. This is something I don't understand, but the engineers have told me so. This is something that has been dragging and taking longer time, but that'll be caught up.
And so about the feeling of the pen, for example, using any hardware on PC compared to the natural iPad
No,
pen.
all the brush settings and brush behaviors and so on are the same on the Windows device as they are on the iPad. Now, if you're using a Windows device with a stylus that does not recognize pen tilt, then that's a fault of the hardware. But it can be remedied by using a different device or by using an additional tablet if you want to buy a Wacom tablet. Even the least expensive Wacom tablets that are manufactured today, I believe, recognize pen tilt. And there are so many alternatives now to Wacom devices that recognize pen tilt as well that you should be in good shape. So yeah. Moving to the ink category, there are many inking options. I'm a fan of inking, and I'm assuming many folks out there are as well. And so we wanted to provide a lot of different feelings for your inking experience. So we have Belgian comics. Anybody who likes, Asterix and all that, you'll like the way this one feels. So very nice. This one is one of my favorites. I probably do most of my inking with this brush. But we also have very thin line work, and that can get very fine if you're interested. This is named after Quentin Blake, the British illustrator. You have blotty inks that have a dotty sort of pattern to them. And I'm going to talk about something special that we developed in the last 2 months that replicates this kind of mark making with vector brushes. And anyway, lots more, but one I wanted to point out specifically is the ink roller. And this is for people who have done work with a brayer before. Very fun to use this. And the reason I wanted to point out this brush in particular was to introduce now this concept of the touch modifier. This circle that you see me dragging on the screen, this is called our touch modifier. This is going to allow you to do a lot of things quickly without having to go to your toolbar, without having to switch tools, without having to interrupt the workflow. And the way the touch modifier works is it has different functions for different tools. By default, if I'm drawing with a brush, okay, and I want to erase with that same brush, if I hold down the touch modifier, I'm going to retain all of the qualities of that brush, all of the textures, all of the ways that it behaves with pressure, sensitivity, and so on, and it's going to instantly turn into eraser. So I can do additive and subtractive work like so, okay? If you want to lock that brush as an eraser, what you do is you double tap that touch modifier, and now I'm just in erasing mode, okay? I can double tap it again and return to my drawing mode. This works for every brush in Fresco. So you literally have, if you are going to import brushes, for example, thousands and thousands of brushes and erasers, they'll all work together, okay? Alrighty. Oh, and I guess because it has such an interesting look, I'll point this one out. This is a wet ink brush. And for anybody who's used a brush for doing their inking, and if the brush starts to bleed a little bit into the paper or is slightly watery, this will give you that kind of effect. So we thought about a lot of ways to emulate natural media, even the kinds of things that normally you wouldn't try and do in a digital environment. Okay. The lettering category is self-explanatory. This is for people who do a lot of digital lettering work. So there are many options there. And then the markers are interesting tools in and of themselves. They have different qualities to them that we don't have with the other brushes. For example, the way they blend color is unique. So if I color with a marker, hopefully you can see that. It has a very realistic appearance to it. Using another color on top of it, you'll see what happens. It will actually use a specific blending mode to bring out vibrant color with the blends. So you're not just using a opaque kind of a blending mode, you're using a specific kind of blending mode that will create more beautiful color. So again, then if I were to move over to something like a reddish color and come over the top, you'll see how that yellow will warm it up, but it does not desaturate it. So this can be quite nice to work with if you're going to do this kind of color comp work for your projects. And you're used to working with things like Copic markers or Copic, I'm not sure how you say it. You have some interesting options there. There's also a marker brush. It has the same color mixing properties. Mixer brushes are, if anybody's familiar with this category in Photoshop, they're the same thing. So mixer brushes allow you to mix paint on the surface. So if I were to use a mixer brush, here you'll see that by bringing the yellow over into the blue and the green, it will mix and pull that color with it. You can actually import mixer brushes the same way you would import regular Photoshop brushes, because everything you save to a library can be imported, and any ABR file you save out of Photoshop can be imported to Fresco as well. And just to take a pause for a moment here and talk about that, because everybody has brushes they like to use. They have your custom brushes that you prefer. If you tap on the brushes here, look towards the bottom. There's a little plus symbol. If I tap on that, you'll see the option to import from files. So if I have an ABR file saved in my Dropbox or elsewhere, I can import brushes that way. The other way to import brushes is to follow a library of brushes from the Adobe brush library. And you do that by tapping on Discover New Brushes. When you do that, what you're going to see are all the brushes that are available to you if you have a Creative Cloud subscription. So you have, for example, the brushes I just made a few months ago, the fall 2021 brushes right here, summer 2021. So you see all these updates, and then you have these traditional packs like the Mega Pack, which has, it says over 300 brushes. It's actually over 400. The Keith Haring inspired brushes, spring, more updates, gouache, dry media, everything you need, manga. If there's a certain library of brushes here that you say, oh yeah, I'd like to use those, what you do is you just tap on where it says follow, and those brushes are going to be included in Fresco. So for example, if I wanted to use, let's say, these Keith Haring inspired brushes, I would just tap follow, and it'll tell me that it's downloading those brushes into the library, and those will show up then. That's done. If I tap here and go back to my category of brushes, you'll see under libraries, Keith Haring inspired brushes right here, and it'll start to load those brushes in. And then those brushes, once they're loaded, every time I open Fresco, they'll always be there. If I don't want those brushes anymore, and if it's crowding on my scene, I just go ahead and unfollow and they will disappear again. Okay, so that is how that works. All right. So mixer brushes, yes, you understand how they work. They allow you to mix paint on the surface. All of the brush settings that you normally would have for mixer brushes are included here where it says mixing. So you'll see the same things you would see in Photoshop: the wetness of the brush, the load, and the mixing of the brush. And if you turn the mixing down to 0 and the wetness down to 0, whatever that brush is will behave in such a way that there are no mixing properties whatsoever. And so you have
brush without mixing.
Exactly. Which sometimes people will like the way the brush behaves and they don't want the mixing properties. But what's nice is you can, of course, make it very, very subtle. So I could do, 5 and 5. And now I'm going to get a nice subtle effect. So it's a little bit of paint getting picked up, but not much. So easy way to control what the possibilities are there.
It looks very simple to use, and I remember that a lot of people had troubles using them in Photoshop, but it looks so easy to use them right now in Fresco.
We made it, right. So we tried to create the brush settings panel in such a way here that would be a little bit more easy to understand for users than the Photoshop brush panel, which can be very intimidating for people, especially with mixer brushes with that bar up at the top. You're not quite sure what all the presets mean and so on. Hopefully the number of brushes we included here as well will cover the basis for what people need. So if somebody, for example, would just want a very standard mixer brush with the thick to thin behavior, they could just use something like this. And it's kind of like a regular Photoshop brush with a bit of canvas texture. You can see that. So for those people who are into oil painting and oil painting effects, this is the kind of brush that hopefully will get them to where they want to go. But we do have other options there as well. In the painting category, of course, we have a lot of brushes. You have everything from Georges Seurat, so you have this, things where you can do pointillism, and you can do impressionistic work like that, as well as things like a natural brush. This is something that most people would use for very straight up normal digital painting. Little bit of texture, nice responsiveness to pen pressure. Okay, anybody who's a fan of working with brushes like the gouache brushes and things like that, this will help you out. We're talking about touch gestures, and I just want to point out that just like Procreate or any other app you use on an iPad, simply tapping and holding on the screen is going to get you your color picker. So that makes it easy for me to just go ahead and grab another color, etc. Right? I'll point out something very special about that, though, with the touch modifier after we cover the brushes. But yeah, tons of options here. Really nice effects with the brushes for painting, and I think you'll find a lot of good options. Whatever suits your style, you'll be able to find it in here. Straight up canvas brushes. Important to mention that for those people who do want oil painting effects and things like that, we do have a specific category for that, which I'll show you. But I just showed you a mixer brush with oils, and this is another brush in the painting category that has oils. And I want to point out that the canvas texture that you get for all of the brushes will be consistent, so that you're not having to create double canvas textures or something bizarre like that. All right? You're always going to get the same canvas texture with any of those brushes. Block stain is one of my favorites, just for its ability to eventually build up to 100% opacity, and some pretty cool things. All right, let's clear that away. And the rake brush category, anybody who's used rake brushes knows what these are, but they allow you to do, oh, sorry, I didn't select one. Here we go, big rake, there we go. You can do some rake brush effects, all right? I use the rake pressure brush more than any because it allows me to change the direction of the rake with the pressure of the pen. So this does some really interesting effects. And I like to use that for special effects, for adding texture, for just adding cool detail in the background and things like that. Okay. And finally, sketching, which we've already covered. Those are the 12 basic categories of brushes in Fresco in the pixel category. like I said, we're going to spend a lot of time in brushes because we just covered that, but now you have this very special category, which is our live brushes. So this is the second option right here. And in here you have watercolor and oils. I'll start with oils because they're a little simpler, and then I'll move to the watercolor. With the oils, you have 7 brushes that you can select from, and each of these has a different shape and behavior to it. I'll go ahead and use the oil paint round brush, which is kind of the most basic. And you could imagine this being like a round brush you would use for traditional oil painting. By the way, when I tap on my color picker, you'll notice at the bottom here where it says recents, all of the colors you use in your document will always be here for you to grab anytime. So you never have to worry about remembering what color you used. They're always available. I'll just tap over to the left where it says all and point out that this is where all my color libraries live. So if you created color swatch libraries in Photoshop or elsewhere, they will also automatically show up in Fresco. For example, I had some colors here that I used for a workshop for 99U a few years ago. Those are available to me and I can find them no problem. This is especially good if you're working on a project with a group of people who are sharing color libraries, or for a client that has specific color requirements. You can make sure and create a library for those colors and you have them available to you. All right, so let's take a look at the oil paints. I'm going to put some color down with this round brush right here, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see that as I apply more pressure and make a little pattern like that, the paint itself has depth to it. So this is nice, thick, gooey paint, okay? Light pressure means I'm just going to graze the surface, right? And you can see there's a little canvas texture as well that shows up. Let's go ahead and select another color and then paint into it. And voila, you're going to get a nice mix of those colors, all right? So this is the most natural oil painting experience and the zippiest I've used. It's one of the main things we had in mind for using natural media in Fresco was to keep things simple. I don't like having to use a billion sliders. Painter is a great program. I've been a fan of it for many, many years. But in order to get the effects I want, I have to use many, many, many sliders. And that's fine if you're a seasoned pro and you're used to using these things. But in the midst of painting, if I want to control my oil paints, if I'm using real oil paint, I just control with medium. I'm either thinning the paint out, or I'm thickening it up, or I'm using less or more paint on my brush. And there's really not much else to it. And we wanted to employ that same way of thinking here for the app. So make my brush a little bigger. Right here you have brush flow. And brush flow, just like it would control the flow of the paint with any of the other pixel brushes, what this essentially does with oil paints is it just controls how thick the paint is. So if I go way down to a thinner paint, like 30, okay, you'll notice that when I put the paint down, it's slightly translucent, okay? So it's going to pick up the color that's there, that blue that I was painting with earlier, but it's also going to be not 100% opaque. So this is the same as using thinned down oil paints. So all you have to do is use the flow to control the thickness of the paint. If you crank it all the way up to the top, of course, it's going to be fatter paint, all right? And you can see how nice it is to get those shadows inside of the bristle marks, so you can really feel how gooey that paint is. The other thing we control is how much it mixes, and that's it. That's all you need. So you have how much the paint mixes with what's on the canvas and how thick the paint is. And between those two things, you should be able to get the range of effects you need for any kind of oil painting work. So if I decide that it's not going to mix very much, then my bringing it into this blue is only going to pick up a tiny bit of that blue that's already on the canvas, okay? If I put down another color, let's fill this area right here. We could do a little comparison, and this should make sense then. Go back to my yellow. Right now I have the mixing set very low, so put it like 11%, okay? And I paint into the pink, you'll see what happens, right? Now let's go ahead and crank that up to 100, and you see it more quickly picks up what's on the canvas, okay? So the way that works is if you want to pick up the colors that are on the canvas, increase the mixing. If you don't want to pick up so many of them, decrease the mixing. And the same works for flow. The thinner the paint is, the less power it will have to hold on to the color that you have already chosen in your color picker, and the more influence the colors that are already on the canvas will have over what you're painting. All right, so if I bring in my color now, that pink quickly takes over because I'm using thinner paint. This is kind of what you'd expect to happen with natural materials. Brush settings are just what you'd expect. You have the pressure dynamics, you have velocity dynamics, which we mentioned with our pen earlier on. So you can have the size be controlled by how fast you move and so on. The flow can also be changed this way. For those of you who are really hardcore traditionalists and want to have that effect, this is going to be a very familiar thing to you. If I have my brush on traditional canvas and I'm painting with oils and I'm moving along at a slow, steady clip and letting that paint deposit onto the canvas, and then I suddenly jump over to another area, I'm going to graze the surface more quickly and not deposit as much paint. So if I want to, I can have the flow set to 100% on velocity dynamics, which means this is going to have a very strong impact. So as I'm painting with this brush, if I jump over, sorry, I did it the opposite direction. Pardon me. There we go. That's what needs to happen. So you see, as I move quickly, what happens? As I move quickly, the paint breaks apart and does not get deposited on the canvas in such a thick way, okay? Clear that away and I'll do a little demo here. Slow and steady, zippy, 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 all right? So this is an interesting thing to do, and for those of you who want the more natural sort of effects, you can do that. You can fine tune it. So if it's breaking apart too much, go ahead and knock that back so it's not quite as powerful. I'll probably put it somewhere in the middle there to maybe like 80%. That feels good. Yeah, I like that. So there you go. That pretty much covers what oils do. If there are any questions about that, please go ahead and let me know.
I have a request. It's more a request than a question, but
Sure.
you already said that you have a special forum, I think, or place where people can write requests. But anyway,
yes,
it's more a UX request. Could we have, please, 2 live brushes icons, watercolors and oils, instead of the 2 sub live colors categories?
The only issue with that is real estate. So because if you're working on an iPad in landscape format, you can see that I'm already, as I move down from the top of the screen down to the bottom, all I have left is this tiny little bit of space right here. So if I add another category up here and take up another square, this could be problematic as we get further along and don't have space at the bottom to add any other special new tools in the coming year. So it's a good request, but I would say that it's unlikely to happen just because we're trying to nest things in logical ways and not create such a long toolbar that we then wind up with problems where you'd actually have to scroll the toolbar itself. So I hope that explains why we would choose to nest things where they make sense.
And I had another question about the limitation of resolution, whatever its size in pixels or in DPI.
8,000 pixels by 8,000 pixels is the current maximum size, and unlimited layers. There are no layer limits in Fresco. So if you want to have 400 layers in your document, you can. Now, the only limitation will be the hardware. If your iPad decides to break and fall apart, that's dependent on the iPad. You know, how many gigs of storage do you have, etc. But no, we don't limit the user in that way. And like I said up front, 8,000 pixels by 8,000 pixels is the current limitation, but we're already looking at increasing that because of these newer iPads having the capability to be able to handle larger files. We're going to be increasing that as time goes by because we like to keep up with what's possible.
And what would be your advice in terms of minimum configuration for an iPad, for example, to start to play with Fresco without frustration, I would say, because we all know that when we are using old version, sometimes it can be
So I have two iPad Pros at home that were part of a project I did with Apple that were given to me for test purposes in 2017, which I believe was not too long after the very first iPad Pro was released. Is that right? Yeah. I know they were given to me in 2017. Those iPads run Fresco perfectly. I have no lag and no issues. So I would say if you have an iPad Pro from that era, you're fine. Today, I would say I would invest in an iPad Air in the medium configuration. I think that's perfect place to start. You do not need an iPad Pro. An iPad Pro is a great device, but it's not necessary to enjoy an app like Fresco and get really good results. I think an iPad Air is a great, great device. And I would just say max out the storage or the memory that's available. So I think you can go with iPad Air. I think you can get up to 128 gigs. Is that right?
I think
Something
so.
like that. So I'm gonna have to double check.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think so.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
that would be my advice.
Okay, another question about competitors. So, in your opinion, what's the best or the biggest advantage in Fresco compared to any other application on iPad?
So several advantages, and I haven't even scratched the surface of all that, but let's talk about first files. Your Photoshop files are your Fresco files. Your Fresco files are your Photoshop files. You're not having to do anything by saving them elsewhere or move them from one place to another or do certain kinds of conversions or anything like that. Everything you create in Fresco is a native Photoshop file. Everything you create in Photoshop can be opened in Fresco immediately because it's already there. It's already in your cloud. It's already part of your ecosystem. So you have this advantage right there. Your files travel with you. If your device breaks or is stolen, it has nothing to do with your work. Your work is still available to you. So you don't lose work. And these files, of course, travel across different platforms as well. Windows, Apple. You want to open a Fresco file on your iPhone and draw on it, you can. It's all going to be part of the same network, or the same cloud, I mean. So that's one huge advantage. We do have live brushes as well, as we haven't talked about vector brushes yet, and capture brushes, and vector shapes. So Fresco gives you the ability to draw with raster brushes, which we've been demonstrating so far, but we haven't even looked yet at vector brushes. And these live brushes stay wet. So what I was just demonstrating with the oils a moment ago, if I close that file and I come back to it a year later, everything on the canvas is still wet, and still I can manipulate it and continue to paint with oils. The oil paints also work with anything that's a pixel on the screen can be mixed into the oils. And the same I'll show you goes with watercolors. So anything you use with watercolors that's wet can be mixed into other pixel brushes. So there are these advanced things which hopefully have time to cover a little bit today, but if not, I'll make sure we do it next week. But there are these advanced painting techniques that you can do only in Fresco and nowhere else. And this is really helpful for people who have special effects for natural media they want to emulate, or just certain kinds of effects that they find work for their particular style that you can't do anywhere else. So the vector capabilities and being able to send files to Illustrator directly from Fresco, whether it's on desktop or on iPad, is great. The Photoshop files being native to the app. The unlimited layers, I think this is another thing that other apps don't give you. So we're not limiting the user in any way with the number of layers. A lot of other apps, what happens is they'll tell you if you want to work at this specific size or you want to use these certain features, you're limited to 40 layers or 80 layers or whatever it is. This does not exist here. So I will also point out some other advantages about capture. A lot of people don't take advantage of Adobe Capture. I think they don't even know it exists. So it's a shame, because this is one of the most incredible free resources you can have as a digital artist. You can create patterns, seamless tiling patterns. You can create brushes. You can create 3D textures. You can create color themes. You can create vector shapes. You can create so much stuff in that app, and all of it works in Fresco. You just round trip back and forth or around. It's pretty interesting, and I'll point that out as well. So let's move over to the watercolors here. Watercolors in Fresco are my favorite brushes to use just because they're so fun. I'll use the watercolor wash flat brush to start with. Again, the idea is to keep it simple. If you out there use traditional watercolors, as I hope some of you do, or have at least used at some point in your lives, you know that the only thing you need to control with watercolor is how much water you're using and how much paint you're using. That's it. Is the brush drier or wetter? How much paint's on the brush? Between those two things, you have all the effects that are possible with watercolor. And so that's what we do here. The flow in this case, okay, is going to control how much paint is on the brush, right? You can see that changing as I slide it up and down, all right? The water is simply going to control how much water is on the brush, either none or somewhere in the middle, or a lot of water. If I have a lot of water and I paint with the brush, you'll see that the water, of course, is going to make the paint spread and move with a lot of water. And that paint is always wet. So you're not going to make a mark and then worry that, okay, now I've made the mark and it's going to have an outline around it and I can't continue to add paint. That doesn't happen. Just like real watercolor, it stays wet and you can continue to add to your wash, and you're going to continue to paint and continue to add water and continue to add media, and you're going to see how that paint will move and spread every time you touch the brush to the paper. And other colors, of course, will mix beautifully with it. So as I come in here and add these colors, you'll see that I'm going to get a really beautiful wash. The other thing we've done is we've invested a lot of time and energy into creating a grain that occurs depending on how much mixing happens with the paint and how much buildup of paint there is. So those of you who are watercolorists know about these nice grainy, unpredictable, beautiful patterns you get inside of the paint. All of that happens here as well. So you can see it pushing and pushing and pushing as I go outward. Now, if I use less water, okay, bring it way down here to like 20, and then I paint over here, you're going to see that the paint does not move as far, and the paint that I deposit, you can clearly see the brush strokes as well as where it overlaps another area that's a little bit more wet. So this is where you get into having these effects that are going to be behaving like the real thing, where you can control your edges, you can control how much blending you have, and so on. So I'll go ahead and reduce the flow and increase the water now. So here I have very little paint on my brush, but I have a lot of water. And this is also going to give me some really lovely effects. So if I come in to this edge, for example, you see how it pulls that paint into it, but the area that I painted is lighter because I don't have as much paint on the brush to start with, like so. So that is the basic behavior of the watercolors, and really you can just do whatever you want in terms of the wash effects. It's really lovely. But I want to point out a few special things here now. If at some point you wish to dry this layer, you can. You can tap on your layer, and at the bottom you'll see this option here, dry layer. If I dry the layer, okay, that option disappears because now the layer is dry. I can actually reactivate some of that paint. And a common thing people do with watercolor is, for example, they'll grab a toothbrush or a brush and they'll put some water on it, and they will spatter it on top of the paint that is already semi-dry. You can do that in Fresco as well. So I'll go ahead and increase the size. This is a spatter brush in the watercolor brush category. And I'm going to tap on my color picker here. At the bottom right of the color picker, right here, you'll see a transparent circle. If I tap on that circle, it takes all the paint out of the brush. And now, if I just spatter on top of the area where I was a moment ago painting, look what happens. You're starting to reactivate that paint. So wherever the water lands, it takes the paint that was dry, it wets it, and pushes it out to the edges of the drops of water, which is just what happens with real watercolor. So if you want to create these nice textural areas, maybe you're painting some rocks or some other stuff, and you want to create these beautiful watercolor effects with the texture of water being spattered onto semi-dry or dry paint, you can do that by employing this technique. The other thing that happens is if I actually do apply some color to the brush, okay, so I'm going to increase this opacity of the color here. I'll use a darker color now. If I paint over an area that is wet, it will actually push some of the paint away from it and reactivate it, like so. Okay, so this is a pretty interesting way to work because you have the ability to paint with a little bit less opacity while still retaining that color and retaining some of the edges. But you can also, of course, because we're in a digital painting environment, add layers. So here I could paint another shape. It's going to be 100% opaque, more or less, but it's still watercolor. So I could get rid of all the paint by tapping on that right there, that little transparent circle. Maybe use the wash soft brush with just a little bit of water and a little bit of flow. And if I touch this area that I just painted here, see what it does? It just softens that edge and spreads that paint out just a little. And the more I do it, the more it pulls that paint away. And then what I could do is merge those layers. So if I merge down right here, merge these layers together, they're now one watercolor layer. So I could come in and blend all of it together. And if I increase the amount of water I'm using and make my brush really big, everything is fair game. So you have the ability to work with the medium that's more dry, make it more wet, make it dry again, re-wet it, and so on and so forth. And so this gives you all kinds of possibilities for controlling what is a famously uncontrollable medium, watercolor.
Sorry, I have
Yes.
one question related to this. Is there an option to work on a wet canvas?
Oh, that's a great question. There is, but you have to wet it. So what I would do is this. I would grab my watercolor brush and make it 500 pixels. So it's much bigger. And I would use the water, right? So I've got all the color gone. And then just go ahead, turn that up, and and then just go ahead and just do this. Just paint.
But this is what you are doing in real life if you want a wet canvas.
Yep, just like real life. Now it's wet. So if I were to now take a color, and let's do that. So we'll grab a color. If I touch the canvas, see what happens? It starts to spread because that is a wet piece of paper. So it does require a few seconds of work on your part to actually wet the paper if you want.
I had another question and I reply in the chat and I hope I have typed the right answer. But so someone were asking if you will add a frame by frame animation feature in Fresco, and I reply that it's already there, and it's
already there. All the animation tools.
Show in next session.
Yes, next week I'm going to show you all the animation features are here in this little guy. Animation. We have more than frame by frame animation in Fresco. We also have motion path animation. Very, very cool stuff, and it requires a bit of time to demonstrate. So I'll do that next week. All right, so I'm trying to get through brushes. I know it's a lot here. Quickly want to point out that anything can be wet on your canvas. This is such a cool thing. So if I'm drawing with pencil, for example, and I want to wet some of that pencil, I can do that. I can, again, use just a wet brush, right? Make my brush a little smaller, less flow, just a little bit of water. And I can come in here and now I'm taking that graphite, see that? And I'm just wetting it. So this is just a really cool thing to be able to do. Anything is fair game. Any area of the canvas that you paint or draw on can be made wet. So for people who do inking too, and they want to do wash effects with their ink, you can do that as well, which is pretty neat. And I forgot to mention this, but the oils, because of their mixing properties, can be used the same way. So for example, if I grab this oil round brush, it has no color in it right now. So you can see me painting out here and nothing's happening. But if I come over here and actually pick up some of the black that's on there, it loads it onto the brush and you paint with it. So that means I could come in here and I can use that brush to start blending parts of this together, right? So really anything can be blended. because we're in a pixel category, I want to skip over vector brushes for just a moment and talk about smudging, because smudging is a normal thing everyone does in digital art. Any brush can be a smudge tool in Fresco, so you can just select from all your brush categories. If I wanted smudge with some soft chalk, grab the soft chalk, start smudging. Okay. The intensity of the smudging can be changed here with the strength. And what I like to do is increase the spacing here in my brush settings. If I increase the spacing of the smudging, I can get subtler effects. So up here, for example, if I smudge, you see what's happening? I'm smudging, but I'm still retaining texture of that smudge tool. And it's just taking all that medium and just pulling it away, and I'm retaining the texture of it. So this is good for people who do things like charcoal drawing and stuff like that, and they want to just do some subtle smudging and they still want to retain that texture of what they're working with. Just use a smudge tool that has texture built in. The texture of your smudge tool will always be recognized and will work with the brushes. And what's interesting about that is that means, I'll undo some of that here for a moment, that if I use oils and I smudge with the oils, the dimension of the oils will actually be recognized in the smudging, which is a difficult thing to talk about and much easier to demonstrate. And we're talking earlier about advantages of working here in Fresco. This is something you can't do anywhere else. If I grab an oil brush and I put some color down, so let's do that. All right, lots of paint, lots of mixing. There, big chunky bit of oil. I can take a smudge tool and I could use a weird one. So for example, what if I go to a spatter tool? So here's a spatter smudge tool, okay? And let me reduce the strength there. Let me see if you can see this. Here, can you see what's happening? The spatter that's touching the paint is creating these bumps and divots inside the paint. So you're actually able to sort of cut into the oil paint. So if I were to use something else, let's say a brush that has a leafy pattern like this. Let me increase the strength there. I'm making imprints. I don't know if y'all can see that. Can you see it? Is it too subtle?
No, we can see.
There.
If people are watching in full screen.
Excellent.
No,
so you're now able to actually sort of cut
in zooming the bump.
Yes. So what this means is you can do some very interesting relief effects with your painting by using the smudge tool, which is a pretty curious and fascinating way to work. And I mean, I've only just begun to explore what's possible with that because I didn't even know it was possible until a few months ago.
Sounds like a good tool also to experiment a lot of things with watercolor, mixing everything and discover new texture.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't have enough time to do all that kind of experimentation live, but to show you these demonstrations, hopefully this is getting your mind going on what's possible. But yeah, smudge tool can be any brush, so that makes it easy. You want to smudge with something, smudge with it. Anything can be a smudge tool.
I had a question also, but someone were asking and already figure out it's possible, but I think it's good to ask a question for the public if it's possible to import as a background picture from the CC library, for example, as reference, I guess, or something like that.
Absolutely. So if you go over to your photos, so look down here, you see a little image. I can take a picture and use that right away on the canvas. I can import from files from Creative Cloud, which is, again, another advantage. All the images I have in Creative Cloud are just available right away. But if I go to my photo library, let's say I want to grab something like this, and I can take that and I can set it off my canvas over here, and I can use that as reference and start drawing. Or I can make it part of my image. In fact, I just did a demonstration a few days ago with images where I showed that you can actually turn them into oil paintings very quickly. For example, I'll bring that same image in again. Sorry, that's the That is the one I already painted on. You can see how it's an oil painting there. The way that works is I convert it to a pixel layer, so it's no longer an image file. And I grab my oil brush, and again, just take out the color. Make sure the mixing and the thickness are up really high. What happens is, because it's going to pick up whatever color is on the canvas, right? I can just paint over it. And it's just taking whatever colors are on the canvas, adding them to the brush, and then painting with those right away. So this is a really cool way to take a photo and then change it into an oil painting. I hope what I'm doing here makes sense. I know it's a little weird. I'm doing it very quickly, but
I think a lot of concept artists are doing overpaint, and it could open to a new way to do overpaint using texture.
Yeah, you just, by changing the brush size and the brush behavior. So right now I haven't messed with the sensitivity of the brush, but I can change, the pressure dynamics, how much pressure will influence, what happens when if I use less pressure or more pressure, what that's going to do to the sensitivity of the brush, right? And how much color it picks up or doesn't pick up, and how much it blends and how much it doesn't blend. So I could really quickly go ahead and convert this into a full-blown oil painting. See what I mean?
Yeah. Are there any different, are there some different color mode as RGB, CMYK, or just RGB?
No, there's no CMYK in Fresco now, but this has been a request we got in 2021. A lot of people said, will you add CMYK? And so now there is a ticket for that work for the engineers. And I don't know where that stands right now, but I do know it exists, and I do know this request is real. So we have to see, whether this is a practical thing to do, or whether, because of all the access people have now to digital printers and digital presses and the quality of digital printing, whether this is even necessary.
Yeah.
We have to, I don't know.
Because at the end, when we see how Photoshop work, there are some limitation with filters, for example, in CMYK, and I guess it's because it's more difficult and another algorithm to make, and it would not. I don't know if it would make sense to make some very high-end feature like oil painting and watercolor in 2 modes. I don't know. Perhaps it's super complicated.
Yeah, I don't know. And me not being an engineer, I don't know what work is involved in making that happen. It could be easier than I'm imagining, but the fact that we haven't done it yet leads me to believe that it's quite a bit of work. But I don't know. But it is a request we've had. So the fact that it came up in the chat is not surprising to me. I think the thing to do is make this request, and I'll show you quickly on the home screen here. You'll see right here where it says new and upcoming features. Just tap on that. And at the bottom, it says here, what's coming? See where it says coming soon to Fresco, and at the bottom, suggest features. This is the place to go. If you suggest a feature here, it goes straight to the Fresco team. And this is how the product managers, there are 3 product managers on Fresco, and I have a meeting with them every Friday. We talk about these things. If there is a feature that you want, this will show up, and we will be aware of it. Okay. So please do use that. Everything we build in Fresco comes from users. We're very responsive to what people are asking for, and we direct everyone on the team to work based on what those requests are. Of course, we invent our own things as well, and we add to the app based on things that are coming out of the labs. But we also are very responsive to what people are asking for, because we know we want to build what people need. Okay, we talked about smudging and how that works. And hopefully we have just enough time to talk about vector brushes. So this is a completely different category of brush that's infinitely scalable, like anything you do with vector. So if I go ahead and make a little line here, and then I grab a pixel brush, and I'll use an inking brush so they can be similar. And we start to zoom in. You will see that as we go, we're getting to pixels over here from the pixel brush. And of course, the vector brush has no pixels. So we have several different vector brushes to choose from. You can see here, taper brush, which you'll be familiar with from Adobe Draw, which always creates a taper from beginning to end. All right, and this can be good for inking and for drawing in general. The basic round brush, of course, same kind of deal, and you can control the width. A very important thing I'm very sorry I forgot to mention is that for all of the brushes, both vector and pixel, you have line smoothing. So anybody who's used to line stabilization or smoothing or streamline, whatever you want to call it, that's always available to you as well. And that comes here, just underneath where you have your flow. You got smoothing. So of course, if I turn that all the way up to 100, it's going to be very, very, very smooth. Unlike some other apps, we do not change the line quality as you're drawing, so there are no surprises. You just get a smoother line. And you will feel it as you're drawing with it that it is smoother, but you're not going to see it suddenly jump and change or do anything like that. So there's nothing there that you can't predict. With vector brushes, it's the same. You have smoothing right here. So you can make that whatever you wish. And that makes a big difference for how much control you have when you're drawing. There's a flat brush, and that will change depending on the tilt of your brush. Chisel brush, a terminal brush. Terminal brush will always create ends that have a little chunk at the end. That's good for letterers and things like that. You have taper brushes, and they have an end taper, beginning taper, and we have this special category called a velocity taper brush. I use this a lot too for inking. Velocity taper is a special category of brush that allows you to control the taper with velocity. So those of you who, for example, in Clip Studio use a G pen and things like that, and you're used to being able to make marks like this, where I just repeatedly draw, and every line I draw has a little bit of a taper at the beginning and the end, but then sometimes I want to pause and then draw a line, pause, draw a line. You can do the same thing with this velocity taper brush. So I can get something at the beginning of my line that has no taper, but I can have something at the end that does, or I can start fast and pause at the end and get that taper. Of course, I'm using a big brush here, so I'm not going to make a big chunky mark like that. I could reduce the size of the brush and do the same thing. So like so, taper at the end, or taper at both, or pause and drag, pause and drag, pause and drag. There you go. And the newest category of vector brushes is the jitter brushes. So these allow you to have jitter in a vector brush. So you can see that the line changes its size, its diameter, randomly, even though I'm working on a vector file. So everything's still infinitely scalable, but I get nice variation in the line. And this is all editable in your shape dynamics for the brush settings. So if I come down to shape dynamics, you see we have the size of the jitter that can be controlled here, and the distance between the jitter itself. So if you want longer passages that are the same width, you can control it that way. Okay, for example, like this. And if you want to just use presets, we have a medium jitter and a heavy jitter, so you don't have to bother playing around with those brush settings if you don't want to. You should be covered with these.
I have two questions. The first one
is
a technical one about if it's possible to import any brushes without without using the CC library. Sorry.
Yes. Here, when I tap on this little plus symbol at the bottom of a list of brushes, you can import from files. So here I can go and navigate to an ABR file from Photoshop, and I can just import it.
Okay.
And that will give me my brushes.
And the second one is more about as Fresco is replicating the natural brushes, if there is any option planned from Adobe to have a partnership with to work on hardware such as styluses or transparent film you can place on the glass screen of a tablet. So it's a question is asked because thinking that the response with a physical medium is a key to replicate any traditional way of working. And this is
Right.
also something, it's funny because this is something we have seen in another session where someone was putting a piece of paper into his Wacom to replicate this.
Mm-hmm. Interesting question. So first thing I'll say is that Microsoft, with their latest Surface device, has haptics built into the pen. Haptic response is where when you make contact with the surface and then drag, you will get a response in the actual pen, and you will feel as if you are using a tool that has resistance to the screen. Fresco already supports Microsoft haptics on the Surface. So if you do have a Surface device, that's one of the latest ones, and the pen with the haptic response, you can activate or deactivate that haptic response, and that'll automatically get you somewhere towards what you're talking about. The second thing, of course, is to use a screen protector on your device. If you're using an iPad or something else that's a tablet device and you want to have some friction, you can use something like a Paperlike is a brand that makes these kinds of things. Adobe is not investing right now in making any actual hardware or tools. We did that back in 2016, I think it was. There was a Adobe Ink and Slide, which was a device, which was a ruler and a pen that you could use in combination with each
I
other.
can remember something called Project Napoleon or something like that. I don't know if it's the right name, with a kind of rulers and draw line in Photoshop.
That was probably what became the Ink and Slide. Yeah. But Apple now, of course, we have a close partnership with them, and we're always trying to see what they're up to. We don't know until they tell us whether or not they will include things like haptic response with the pencil. I'm sure that in the inner workings of the pencil, there's probably already some kind of support for that. They just haven't activated it on the OS side. I don't know. If that is the case, then probably down the road, things like that could exist on the iPad. So we rely on, I think, our partners that build the hardware to do these kinds of things. We can, of course, have meetings with them and make suggestions from our community, because the best thing, again, is for these suggestions to come to us so we can communicate to them to the people who make the hardware that runs our software. You know what I mean? So that would be my advice. If you have a request like that, go ahead and send it to us, and we can then pass it along to the people who make the stuff that runs our stuff.
Have you tried the haptic device, and what's your opinion about this? And
I have a Surface device arriving tomorrow from Microsoft for that purpose. That is, yes, it was shipped yesterday. Good timing for that question. So then I will have a chance to try it. I don't know. I have no idea what it feels like. I'm curious to see what it's like. I don't know. Yeah. So one quick thing I want to point out, we talked a little bit about the touch modifier, but not much. I showed you that you can erase with it. One of the cool things you can do with vector brushes is, check this out. If I draw somebody, okay, I'm going to draw some lines here. And I'm just going to do really sloppy. Okay. So I'm drawing these lines that are overlapping one another because I want to just be quickly getting it down. Okay, so here's this person. I can now trim away things I don't need. So you take your touch modifier here, you tap it once and tap it one more time, and you get a blue ring. So I double tap it, and then I tap it once more. So it's 3 taps, and I get this blue ring. Now, if I just carve through, I just cut through the stuff I don't want. Cut, cut, cut. It will trim the vectors I don't need. So all I have to do is pass through the excess bits, and they disappear. 1, 2, 3. This is called vector trimming. And it makes it cleaning up your vector art a nice process. So there you go. Vector trimming. That it works with this touch modifier. So if I take the touch modifier and I tap it again, it goes back to normal, and now I'm drawing again. This is something we're going to be working more on in 2022. What we want to do is have this happen. If I go like this, and then I want to trim different sections of this away, at the moment, this is not possible. If I trim that line, it goes away entirely because it was all drawn with one stroke. But we're going to change that so that when you draw with one stroke, if an area crosses another area, we still want you to be able to trim that away. And so that is something the engineers are working on now to bring to the app, because we believe it's a powerful feature that needs to become even more powerful and hopefully save some time for vector artists.
How is it different from an eraser?
Because I'm not having to do any actual erasing. I'm just quickly drawing a line through the area I want to trim. So look, if I go like this, okay, and I want to create a diamond, right? Double tap, tap once more. With an eraser, I would have to erase, right? I just go like this, just pass through. Pass. It cuts it right down to the edge. This is what I have to do with an eraser. I have to erase. Not the same thing. You can see here, right? So I hope that makes sense. Here I just go, whoop, goodbye. So that is vector trimming. Tap and fill with vectors is very nice because, of course, we're working with vector pads, so everything just fills really clean and really fast. And that's with our paint bucket tool. If you're drawing with pixel brushes and you want to tap to fill, if you have a problem with these pixels that show up that you don't want, this border, then I'm happy to say that we are solving that problem with color margin, and it's going to be dynamic. And that's coming in just a couple months. And the way that works is I'll actually show you in our internal build of Fresco. So I'll give you a little preview of how some of these things work. I can draw with a pixel brush. So I'll go ahead and grab something similar to what I was just using. I think it was a natural inker like this. So go ahead and make a line, and I want to fill inside the middle here, okay? What's coming to Fresco is this. If I tap to fill, you'll notice that this color margin slider shows up. And all I have to do is increase that, and it'll dynamically increase the amount of area that gets filled to reduce any of the areas you have that are problematic because of that texture in the brush.
We just see the canvas and not the tool. I don't know, perhaps it's another window. I just see the canvas, but not the cursor. Yeah, I don't know why, but I was just...
Oh, that's interesting. What happened, I wonder?
In the other version, but not in this one.
Oh, you know what? I know what happened. In this internal build, there's a projection mode. And here, there's got to be a way for me to turn that off. I've never used it, but it looks like it's turned on by default. Oh, dear. Oh, interesting. I don't know how to turn that off. It might be in the internal settings. Let me just check really quickly. Internal, experimental. Here we go. Brush discovery. Let's see. Enable.
But we can see the canvas at least.
Oh, here we go. External monitor. Okay. Let me see if I can go back. Can you see it now?
So now let me check. Yes.
Now can you see my menus? Aha. Excellent. Okay, that's a new feature we're playing with. I'm using an internal build right now. So there's a lot of experimental stuff in here. You'll have to forgive me there. Here's another line. If you look at the pixelization here, because this is a pixel brush and because it has a little bit of texture, filling this could be problematic. Okay, but it's not, because I now have the ability to go into transparent pixels like so. So the green that I'm filling into the black is actually going to be filled using transparent pixels so that there's no visible border whatsoever. So that's coming in a future release very, very soon, hopefully by end of January. Okay. In addition to reference layers, which I'm sure people are excited about and they need in their work. I know I do. So if I do this, for example, I draw some line art, draw some line art, draw some line art, I can set this as a reference layer. And then if I have a layer underneath and I start filling with color, right, then this will be independent of the line art. So I have a separate fill layer that's using that line art as a reference. Very good for people who have to do color flatting, who have to do comics, who have to do color illustration with line art and flat color and so on. So that's a nice little preview for you there. Okay. Well, Patrice, there's so much more. I don't know how much time we have together, but I'm really just today going through, I think, a lot of the brushes and some of the basics. There's so many brush categories, but I know that next week we have time to do some more advanced stuff.
Sure. And I was also asking to the people if they want we cover some specific things, but we already had question about animation, and I know this is one of the topics you want to talk about.
Yes, next week I can cover that. And I mean, I have more time today. If you think everyone else would like to learn a few more basics, it's up to you.
It's really up to you. Ready, if you want. Ready.
Okay. Well, so for today, before we do anything, since I'm talking about vector, I do want to point out that we have support for vector shapes in Fresco, which I think is another unique feature of the app. Vector shapes are included right here. You'll see under my paint bucket, I have these shapes. And I have libraries, okay, which are shapes that I've created in Capture or elsewhere as vectors. Vector shapes can be imported into Fresco. You have Fresco comics that are included. So these comic shapes are included with Fresco, and they are infinitely scalable vector shapes. And the way they work is if I tap on one, for example, this word bubble, okay, I can resize it, I can transform it, do whatever I want with it, and I can place it anywhere on my canvas. And if I want to then use that as art, I can choose to fill it. Down here you have options. If you see, we have fill, erase, mask, and select. I can make a selection of that shape and I could paint inside of it, or I could simply fill it. So we'll start by filling it. You'll notice that the first thing Fresco does is ask me, do you want this to be a vector layer or a pixel layer? We keep our vector layers and pixel layers separate so that you don't have any confusion with that. If I say, go ahead and make it a vector layer, it'll fill it with my foreground color. So now we have this vector shape that's on our document, and I can move it anywhere. Okay, so we want this guy to be saying something. I can just flip it around like this, resize it, put it over here, and say done. Okay. And now he's vector, and that line art is vector. So these are both scalable, of course. Any vector shape you want to use, you just tap on the library. You have different shapes here. These are specifically for comics, of course. Okay. So you have different voice bubbles, different effects. I think there are about 30 different shapes in this library. You have independent voice, not the bubble part, but the actual line that goes from the talker. I'm not sure what you call that. Some comics experts out there have to help me with that. You have things like rays, which you can fill. That's a pretty neat little effect you can do. All of this is vector, and any vector shapes you make, you can import. So, for example, I made this character, Death Moth, and that's a logo I was working on for a personal project. I converted it into vector art. From Photoshop, I just took it into Illustrator and just converted it by live tracing it. And now I have it here in Fresco because it was saved to a library, so I can fill that. We can make it a vector layer, and there you go.
A little butterfly.
Yes. Now, this brings me to a quick thing I want to point out, which is how you can make quick vectors of your art anyway. If you have anything you draw that you want to be vector, Let's say, for example, I have something that has some nice texture to it. So maybe I'm using something like this grungy inker, okay? And I do this character. If I start drawing with a pixel brush and I'm already on a vector layer, it'll automatically create a new pixel layer for me. So I don't have to go to the trouble of creating that, okay? Now, this brush has a lot of texture, okay? And this is not a vector brush, but I'd like this to become a vector asset. I'd like to use this for something. Maybe for some reason, some client sees this and says, "Oh, we want to blow this up and print it on the side of a truck for some reason." Okay, and I say, "Oh shoot! Well, I drew it in pixels, so now I'm in trouble because it's not big enough." That's fine. What I can do is I can simply save this as an image. So right here on my publishing and export image options, I can quick export it. This will save it to my camera roll. And then what I do, and we were mentioning this at the top of the show, is use Capture. So I open Adobe Capture and I say, I'd like to make a new shape. I tap on Shapes, and down here at the bottom where I say plus, I say I want to import an image. Go to my camera roll, grab this, and this is the image I want to use. So I'm just going to say OK. I can crop it. And now that is automatically going to become a vector shape. So I can call it whatever I want. I can save it into any of my libraries, right? So I'm going to change the library, make a new library. We'll just call this IAMAG, create, and save. All right, now I just made that into a vector shape. When I come back to Fresco, remember I've got my vector shapes here. I can tap on that, and I'm going to go to a new library called IAMAG, which should show up in the next couple minutes. Oh, wait a second here. Remember, everything I'm doing is having to sync, and I'm doing a live stream. So I got to wait maybe a couple of minutes here. We'll see.
I
Oh,
I
in the
had a
mean,
question waiting for the library
yeah,
to
yeah,
sync. It was about the reference layer. So someone was asking if you, so when you paint over the reference layer, what happens if you had to modify the reference layer? Will it be dynamic with what you have done above? Or do you have to redo
no, no,
everything?
no. You would, well, I mean, if you had to, if you were going to change the shape of something that you filled, there's no way it would be able to know that that line was specific to that shape because drawings don't work that way. So I could be adding details inside of the line art. It could be drawing maybe some shading, or I could add a little detail like a button on a shirt. For the reference layer to know what my intention is as an artist is not really possible. Now, if it's just one big containment shape and you were to change it with liquify or something like that, then you would be able to maybe do those together by using multiple layers with your liquify transform. But for the reference layer fill to know what your intention is with the line art, to me seems like an impossibility. Now, if there's a specific way that this person is asking for it to work, a function of it, they should definitely request that as a feature. If they can explicitly describe how this would be useful in a workflow and what that workflow would be and what the result they expect would be, absolutely, please do make that request so we understand what it is that you need that to do and see if there's a way for us to make that happen. Okay. I'm having trouble getting my libraries to sync, and I'm assuming it's because I'm just doing too many things at once with too many apps.
And, as we are speaking about vector, is it possible to import an Illustrator file?
Yes. An AI file?
Or EPS, I don't know what.
I don't know about an AI file. That's a great question. I know you can export directly to Illustrator. You can go to iPad or desktop from Fresco. But as far as importing, I don't know. When you first launch Fresco, you have the option to import and open files. And currently that says Photoshop file or sketch and draw project.
So it should be limited to
So
this.
no, I think for now it's limited to that.
And can you use custom shapes from Photoshop?
Any shape that you create, as long as you save it into a library as a vector shape, can be used in Fresco because it recognizes vector shapes. And I'm just not seeing the shapes that I made now, but that's, again, a function of me probably trying to do way too much at the same time.
Let's say it will be your next time.
It'll show up, yeah. I just wanted you to see that texture. I thought that was really nice to demonstrate. And I do have something that I vectorized here. So this would be a good example. This was drawn with a charcoal brush. And you can see what it did. It created these individual vector shapes. So capture is a very powerful tool that I don't think enough people are taking advantage of, especially when they're trying to create assets or they're trying to convert something very quickly into vector art. You don't have to go to the trouble of bringing it into Illustrator and using the live trace and so on, even though it's a good feature. You can do just as good a job, if not better, by using capture just like that. It works on your phone, works on your iPad, works on Android, works on everything. So I think people should just make sure they take a look at that. It's quite a good asset.
Very useful.
Also, brushes. I was just going to say, also brushes can be made in Capture, and I've made brushes and used them in here. And another thing to point out, people, again, the question I think being, what is it that sets this app apart? You can use full RGB brushes in Fresco. What I mean is a brush that you could take a photo of something and turn it into a brush, and the full color of that brush will be retained. So, for example, I went and made some brushes for trees in my neighborhood. I just took photos of trees, and I think I put those in Max. Let's see, is it this the one? Yeah, here, bark brushes. I took photos of bark, tree bark, and just there it is. I'm painting with bark. These are called ribbon brushes, and you can resize them. You can add, pressure dynamics to these, but they are full color RGB brushes.
I know so many artists taking pictures for references, but they don't use this application to turn them directly into something. They can use.
You could turn them into, yeah. It's a pretty cool thing. Look, I even did, this is silly but fun. Here's a brush of me. You can make that into a brush. So
let's do a pack with this brush.
Yes, ribbon brushes are fascinating. You can make them into, they can behave with a head, a body, and a tail, which is what this is. You assign different sections of the photo to be different things. They can behave like normal Photoshop brushes. All of that can be created in Capture, and then it just automatically shows up in Fresco because you save it to a library.
This is the ultimate guide brush pack.
Right. This is I scanned some pastel that I drew on paper. I mean, scanned it. Sorry, I took a photo of it in Capture. And see this? I made a brush out of it. So this is just a pastel mark on paper. Took a photo of it, bring it to Capture, say, I want to make this a brush, and there it is. This is fantastic.
And we have the question. I was, when we were preparing this live, I was pretty sure the question will come because it's a natural question. Why Adobe create a separate software like Fresco instead of adding all these great features into Photoshop?
Well, there's a good reason for that. Photoshop is an app that has become over the years something that does a billion things. And for the average user, trying to figure out what all the capabilities are within that massive package, it becomes too intimidating. Fresco is meant to be from the moment you open it, more approachable and more laser focused on one thing and one thing only, which is the needs of animation and illustration, and people who paint and draw for a living. The animation components that we've added are again meant to support people who do illustration. We don't try and put things in this application that are meant for people who do editing of photos or photo collage work or image adjustments and all the many things that you do in Photoshop that involve 3D and involve design. Fresco is for people who draw and paint. And we felt it was time to create an app that was going to only occupy that space and serve those users. Of course, it's impossible to make everybody happy. We know this. So there are going to be features that people have been using for years in Photoshop that they start to get used to using Fresco and they like it, but they wish there was just this one feature that they had in Photoshop. That's where we have to be judicious in what we choose to add to the app without making it slowly become too many things in one app. So I think that's the way to answer that question. For those people who are missing things, they say, I like using Fresco for 90% of my workflow, but there's 10% where I'm lacking this tool or that tool. I would say, please be patient, because either there's a possibility it might come to Fresco, but the other thing is you can jump to Photoshop on the desktop or jump to Photoshop on the iPad and hopefully be able to finish whatever it is you need and still stay in that ecosystem without a lot of work, because the files are compatible and just jump automatically. But I understand the question very much, and I also personally, I would like to have a few more specific drawing and painting features in Photoshop, because of course I started by creating Photoshop brushes. That was my whole passion. But I also see the need for an app like Fresco to exist so that illustrators have a very focused environment in which to work that is not so filled with many tools and options that they don't use. I think the streamlining of that is important.
If I can add a personal feeling, and I just think that it's sometimes, as in studio, people used to work with a lot of application and have a lot of application in a workflow. It's better to have a very well optimized and very speedy applications than a navy one doing everything, just to be more efficient. And this is also something I was experiencing a few years ago when Adobe had started to add 3D in Photoshop, and it was something very easy. And now they have their own application to make 3D, like Dimension, for example, were really efficient compared to do 3D inside Photoshop. So I totally understand that some people want to have everything in the same place, but I also think that sometimes it's better to have dedicated application when they have a good workflow and they can communicate with each other.
Yeah, an app like Fresco, we still have room to grow, and we can continue to grow in a very specific direction, which is a way that supports people who draw and paint. An app like Photoshop, you run out of space to create new tools, or you have to nest them so deeply into subtools, into subtools, into subtools, that the discoverability becomes a problem. This is the battle we have with an app that's 30 years old, which is Photoshop, and has grown like a tree, the rings of a tree, as it becomes more dense, versus an app like Fresco, where we have a pretty clean slate and we can design the experience we hope illustrators will come to appreciate. I also want to remind everybody, this app is only 2 years old. The year it launched to market was only 2 years ago. And so with us coming out with the perspective and the animation and some of the new drawing aids and things, and then in the future coming out with better fill options and selection options and liquify, things that are coming down the road in the next few months. Hopefully this becomes powerful enough for anybody to do what they need as an illustrator, as an artist. Of course, there will always be exceptions, but we try our best to make this do what it can do and not be too complicated.
I also think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Photoshop engine at the very beginning is all about photo manipulation and matte painting,
Yeah.
and it slowly have added some layers, not layers as using, but new tools, I would say, for to draw brushes and so on. But it wasn't really the root of the origin of the project, and perhaps it's
No.
better to have some application really dedicated to these features when the engine don't really have this in its core features.
The other thing too, we got so many requests over the years from artists to be able to draw with vector brushes and raster brushes in Photoshop. And that just became very complex. So the fact that you can do that in Fresco now is an answer to that request. We're trying to create this drawing experience that satisfies people who need both. And that's really another focus of the app is, but without making it a vector application. If you want to work with paths and anchor points and these things, Illustrator already exists for that. We're not trying to incorporate all of that into this app. But for people who draw and want to use vector brushes, we want to make that possible. I just thought of something which I didn't show you because again, this is there, as simple as this app appears on the surface, there is a lot you can do that is unique. And one of them is you can work with multicolor brushes. I was talking about RGB brushes here a second ago, which Capture allows. But any brush you use in Fresco can also work with swatches of color that have limitless colors in those swatches. And what I mean is, if I go to the painting category, for example, and we use the wet bristle brush, here's what it looks like. I paint with that brush, very nice. But what if I want to paint with multiple colors? Well, the touch modifier can be used to sample multiple colors from the canvas. So if I hold it down and then with my other finger use my eyedropper tool, you'll notice in the top right corner, it now says multiple colors. So I've just selected multiple colors to put on the brush. And I can paint with all the qualities of that brush using multiple colors at the same time. Now this, of course, can become quite a powerful tool because in addition to painting with multiple colors, which is in and of itself quite nice, and again, it works with any brush, so any brush I then move to is going to retain those properties. And that swatch is going to be saved right here. You can see it gets saved with all my other recent brushes. So I can go back to it if I like that mix. You can change the hue and saturation and brightness of that multicolor swatch. So all of the arrangements of those colors will change simultaneously by using the HSB sliders right here in your color window. And you can do some pretty interesting special effects. So for example, what if I were to do I'm painting some chains. Okay, I'm doing some like barbarian and he's got some chains on his arms, or we're doing some kind of Frank Frazetta thing where someone is chained to a rock and a demon is about to eat that person, okay? All I have to do is grab any old brush. I'll grab the Belgian Comics brush again and do this. I'll paint my chain link, okay, like that. If I use my multicolor eyedropper, so I hold down the touch modifier, hold down, and place that in the circle like this, and you can zoom in or zoom out to control how much you put in that circle, okay? That creates a chain, and now I'm painting with a chain link. Now you can't tell that I'm painting with a chain link because I'm using a brush that has tight spacing. So why don't we do this? We just open our brush settings, increase the spacing, and I'll increase the size of the brush so you can see this more clearly, okay? Increase the spacing, and under shape dynamics, I'm going to use direction for the brush to control how it will move with the brush. And I'll come back to our spacing again and just tighten that up a little bit and start painting with a chain. And I can adjust that to my heart's content. Make a different brush if I want. I can change the color, etc. But you can create instant custom brushes inside your document for whatever needs you have. And this is a really powerful thing you can do with that multicolor eyedropper. If you want to use the multicolor eyedropper without the touch modifier, you just come to the eyedropper itself. And here's the normal mode for the eyedropper. Notice down here we have a second option which has 4 quadrants. We just tap on that. Now we're in multicolor mode. And we're selecting whatever's on the canvas. Another cool thing you could do is you could paint a 3-dimensional shape. So I'll do that with the natural brush here. And let's grab yellow, paint a little circle here. And then I'll add some dimension to it. So we'll pretend that it's got a light source in the top left corner. And I'll smudge that together a little to make that look a little better. We haven't even talked about the lasso tool, but the lasso tool works as you would expect. You can do polygonal lasso, or you can draw your selections. Okay. So I'll use a circular selection. Holding down the touch modifier gives me a perfect circle. So I'll just do that. I can invert my selection and I can delete everything that's there. All right, now I'm going to lock the layer transparency. That means I can only affect whatever pixels are already there. And I'll go a little darker on my core shadow here, like that. And then I'll go ahead and smudge that. And add maybe a little highlight. Okay. So not the best 3-dimensional sphere, but hopefully you get the idea. Now, if I hold down the touch modifier and select that circle, I can paint now a 3-dimensional looking shape by going to something like a basic brush, and I could use the hard round brush. See what I mean? Let's go ahead and decrease that spacing to 0. We'll hide our selection layer. So now I'm doing all kinds of weird 3D painting just by making that multicolor selection. So there's lots you can do with this multicolor swatch. And I don't have time to show you all of it, but I think you could use your imagination and start to come up with really interesting ways to employ this. It also works with watercolor, and it also works with oil, which is pretty amazing. So grabbing the oils, for example, and painting with them. Get a bigger brush here, hang on. There we go. And I still got that effect turned on where it's gonna go fast or slow. I can turn that off by resetting the brush. But now I'm working with multiple colors in each brushstroke. You can see that, right? And because I also have mixing properties, you can get some pretty subtle oil painting effects with multiple colors by doing this as well. So really the sky's the limit there. You got a lot of different options, okay? See what I mean? There you go. And same with watercolor too. You could grab a watercolor brush, paint with multiple colors. Okay. Really wanted to make sure I pointed that out since it's a useful and unique feature. So Patrice, we talked a lot about brushes today. I thought that might happen, but I think it's important to see what's possible.
Thank you for the extra time. Nice.
Sure.
I think that
happy to do it.
So many rooms for experimentation when we can see what you do with any kind of brushes, coloring, watercolor, and this almost 3D look at the end.
I think it's the benefit of a masterclass like this is that you go a lot deeper into specific things that hopefully certain people in the audience will appreciate that you don't see in a normal overview of an app.
Yeah, and I think that I guess there are a lot of time-saving features, like just creating your own brushes, for example, like you have shown.
Mhm.
And I think it's not something that you can find in an easy way if you can't watch this kind of masterclass.
No, these are sort of hidden features I think that are really useful, but don't always get pointed out or discovered. I should also mention that when you make these brushes, we're also going to have the ability for a full brush studio where you can make and share or save or whatever you want to do your own brushes in Fresco. And this full brush studio is coming this year. So you'll have that environment where you can make multicolor brushes, you can make your own brushes, share them, sell them, do whatever you want. This is all coming this year as well.
My question, I'm not sure. Can you repeat how you add the little drawing up as a brush image again?
Creating a custom brush from a little drawing, is that it? Or
I'm not sure about the question. That's why I was hesitating.
yeah.
Someone has to left the live during a few minutes because he was at a meeting, so he come back and has lost something.
Oh. Well, the basic idea is anything you make on the canvas, if you want to make it into a brush, so this triangle shape, for example, I hold down my touch modifier, this little guy, the circle that's always on the screen, and then with my other finger, I just use my eyedropper.
I think it was about this.
And while they're both held down, it'll select whatever's on the canvas and turn that into a swatch. So if I go to my color swatches now, I see it. It's my most recent swatch, okay? To paint with that, I can then change the brush properties. So any brush now I can load with this triangle if you wish. For example, the hard round brush, if I come to my brush settings and increase the spacing, you'll now see, oh, that brush is comprised of those triangles. So I'm painting with those triangles. That has become my brush.
It's the same process as what you have done for the yellow sphere. Because
exactly. And you just decide how you want that brush to behave based on what you do with your brush. So if I do scattering, right, multiple stamps, and I can come back to the shape dynamics and have the pen pressure control the size, angle jitter, now I'm doing this. So it's the stamp that I've created essentially for the brush. And whatever properties are attributed to that brush, it will use that new shape as a stamp. So it's like you can create instant custom brushes inside your document. Pretty interesting.
Yeah. But I think it totally answers the question. Yes, it was about this. So
great. There is a YouTube video I made for that. If you just go to YouTube and search multicolor Fresco Kyle Webster, you'll find 5 different ways to use this tool.
I hope we will see a lot of experimentation next week from people who have watched this session, or at least people trying.
Yeah, me too. Next week, I'll talk about animation. I'll talk about perspective guides and drawing aids. And I'll cover a couple more small things, but that'll be pretty much it.
One last question. Can you export those brushes as ABR files?
Yes. So as I said, that is what's coming in 2022 is a full brush studio. You'll be able to create and export brushes from Fresco. And you'll be able to save them into groups. You'll be able to do whatever you need to do to make them transportable. Yeah.